I'm going to start talking to you today about process, about how you write a research paper. And I'm guessing that a lot of you haven't ever stopped and thought about your process or had someone talk about process. And so I thought that I'd walk you through this is basically I used to have to walk 5 miles in the snow when I was your age story. This is how we did it back in the day before digital. I remember still my first research paper, it was on the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And my mom was a librarian. So I think it's one reason why I do what I do. I would get off school at 2:30 and she wouldn't get off till 4. So I had basically an hour and a half every day while I waited for her in the library. That led to all sorts of good things. Like I used to read comic books and things like that and go through when I was bored, I'd go through the card catalog and look up things like ghosts and UFOs and Bigfoot, things like that. So here's how it used to work before you had Google. You went to this, wooden chest of cards and you looked up things by subject. So I would look up like England, 16th century, or, maybe the Spanish Armada, or, warfare or whatever along those lines. You look up by subject and they would point you to books and sometimes articles. Usually you had to go to a book that sort of collected articles about a particular subject to find all these sources. So once you did find something that looked useful, you would get your book out, get your journal article out, and you'd start combing through the article, reading it and seeing what you need. And if you found something that looked like a good candidate to put into a research paper, like an interesting fact or a good quote or something along those lines, you get out your handy dandy index cards and you copy down that information. Now you all don't have to do any of that, right? You can just cut and paste. There's a couple of things that sort of were good about the old methodology. One is, again, I was pretty lazy back then, tend to be lazy sometimes now. So I wasn't going to do that copying work on these index cards if I wasn't pretty selective on the front end about what I was going to use. And so, one thing we noticed from the research is a lot of times people now they'll find the first source they can find. They'll start looking through it and they'll look at something that seems like a good candidate, kind of interesting, cut it, paste it, pop it in your notes, or even pop it into your paper, right? Without that sort of rigorous process on the front end. Even at the graduate level, I often see lots of people pulling quotations from intros and the first paragraph. And if you think about it, I mean, intros are usually the place where people say big general things. I'll give you an example from a master's in education paper. Sometimes people will write things like they'll quote things like lecturing is often not the most effective way to reach students. To me, that's like a statement of something along the lines of McDonald's sells hamburgers, right? Or Justin Bieber has been very successful in recent years. I mean, you don't if no duh is the response to that quote, it's not a good quote. So there was rigor on the front end because again, people would do this, would only pick and choose what they felt like hand copying out. The other thing is, of course, you've got the quotes are automatically separated. And how I was taught is the next step is you start going through with a highlighter and you mark on the index card, maybe a particular subject, right? So sticking with the defeat of the Spanish Armada, maybe it was all about the parts of what I was doing was about the build up to the war or tactics, right? Or leadership, and things like that. And so I would come up with different sort of, organizing principles, and I'd use different highlighters to do that. And then, of course, once you've done all that work, and this is where I think there's a big difference between now and then, you could take all these index cards and lay them out on a huge table, and you can manipulate them, right? You can move them around. So until we get the Avengers, Tony Stark, where you can take your materials and move them around physically, like index cards, I think that one of the things that's been lost is we're always working sort of with a small space, right? You see only a little bit of your paper at a time. And even if you go back and you do your notes, I'm sure that you all probably don't print out your notes and cut and paste them, right? And do this sort of organizing work. And again, there are different ways to do this. I'm just sort of trying to talk about the old methodology and maybe some of the ways that the new digital methodology has sort of, changed that process. And of course, for the most part, it's changed it for the better. I mean, I'd love to have all that time back. I used to have, pouring through the card catalog, trying to find sources. And now I can do that in nanoseconds, right? And so, I mean, there's huge advantages, but there are some pitfalls to process. What I want you all to do is to start thinking about writing from the bottom up instead of the top down. better example, though, is from the 2012 Republican convention. And you all may not have been paying attention much to politics at the time, but obviously the Republicans never get Hollywood types, right? So they were super psyched that they got Clint Eastwood. And the thing is, though, he came and he really didn't have much to say. And I'm hoping this will play, but let me see if I can get this to play here.
Oh, Mr. President, how do you handle promises that you've made when you were running for election, and how do you handle it? I mean, what do you say to people? Do you just I know people.
Okay, I'll stop the pain. That goes on for like 3 minutes. And basically, he came to the convention, and I think his two top ideas were Obama's a nice guy, but we got no jobs. All right. And he ran out of things to say. And so for 10 minutes, all he's saying is he has to actually pretend like Obama is in that chair. And he says these general vague things. Now, if Clint had come to the writing center about the speech, what I would have told him is that I would have said, hey, Clint, you were a mayor of Carmel by the Sea in California. Did you ever have a situation where a factory in your town was leaving, or a red tide came along and it hurt your tourist trade? What are your ideas about finding jobs? Okay, great. Find a moment when you showed leadership and talk about how Obama's not doing that. Okay. So again, the idea, if you start with the top down, what you end up saying is, if you're writing about environmental issues, people might say something along the lines of, pollution is a prevalent problem in today's world, right? Claude Monet was one of the most profound artists of the 19th century, right? So that's when you do top down, a lot of times your first draft or even your final draft of your introductory paragraph starts off that way. And think about this, right? Like, what if I sat down to you cold next to a bench and I said, hey, Kayla, I'll pick on you since I just talked to you. Hey, Kayla, how are you? Did you know pollution was a prevalent problem in today's society? What are you going to say? Are you really going to want to spend some time with me if I sit down and say that to you? Are you engaged? Wow, thank you, Brent. Dr. Stevens, that's super cool. I had no idea. See what I'm saying? So, and again, this is from social sciences, right? But there's this thing called the primacy effect and the recency effect. And so your most important real estate, and when you talk to a reader through your paper, is the first thing that you say and the last thing you say. That's true of paragraphs as well, right? That's why topic sentences and transitions are very important. The first thing you say in a paragraph and the last thing you say in a paragraph are what people tend to remember, okay? So you don't want to waste that space by starting off too broadly. And again, we call this in my business cinema scoping. This is film history, but movies in 1954 to compete with television went to a widescreen format that you all know now in all of your movies. Your TVs look that way. Back in the day, TVs were what we call a 4:3 or classic ratio, and so they were more square. You may have seen this in your great grandparents' houses or something along those lines. And so again, but what it means for here is you're starting off your topic too broad, and you may have heard this in some of your high school English classes, where you're supposed to do what's called the triangle approach, where you start off very general and you work down to a thesis statement that's kind of specific. I think that's the wrong way. I think you need to flip that triangle, right? And a lot of times the best thing you can do is start off with something that's kind of engaging, right? A statistic that doesn't make any sense. And then actually build up to a thesis statement, right? It's much more engaging to do that with your readers. Another example of this is, let's say, okay, you're talking about the conflict, right, between Palestine and Israel. And so you look up conflict in the dictionary, right? And so you start off with, say, Webster's online dictionary defines conflict as, and again, here's the thing though, these are ways to sort of get over the tyranny of the blank screen, right? You've got to get yourself started somehow. So your mind works that way, right? I've got to get something down. Okay, Claude Monet was the most important artist of his generation, right? Something along those lines, and you've got some work done. But the thing is, but just like scaffolding with a building, once you've built something interesting, you want to go back and take that scaffolding away. And again, I'm sure that not all of you are doing this consciously, but that mindset of starting from the top down can lead to some issues like this. Okay, I just point this out. I'm a big visual rhetoric person. And so this is even true when people are incorporating documents that are visual. This is an article from Market Watch like 5 years ago. It's just, here's when to get rid of rotten investments. So just as an experiment, I looked at this clip art and I typed in rotten vegetables and clicked on images. And the first darn thing that came up was this, right? So this is the pitfall too of when you start sort of finding information to use in your documents. You don't want to grab the first thing that comes up, right? Because usually a lot of those things will be kind of a top-down approach. You usually generally don't want to grab a quotation from someone's intro, because for the most part, they fall into this category of being really, really broad in the opening. And then, you know, the real meat of their paper, the real interesting ideas often are sort of in the bodies, the body paragraphs. Okay, here's another thing that's really problematic that I think is common today, is that people will either listen to the podcast, watch a movie, read an article, read a book, set it aside, and then a couple weeks later they'll go to write, right? So what do you think might be the pitfalls if you do things that way? And some of you probably have experienced that.
You forget it. Like you forget what your first thoughts might have been.
You forget your first thoughts, you lose energy, right? I always use the Matrix, right? The scene that people remember the most is when Keanu Reeves is backing up like this and all the bullets are flying in slow-mo. Really interesting spectacle, right? Visually, almost useless as in terms of analytical thought, right? If I want to write a paper about the Matrix, you know, describing that scene, which is maybe the first thing that might come to mind 3 months later after watching it, is not going to be very useful to me in writing a paper about how, you know, the Matrix is a forerunner of this blurring of our digital self and analog self, right? Okay, so again, I did this part. Okay, here's the thing too. I've got a friend up the road named Parker Muth. He works at UVA, and he is termed this kind of approach to make essays. And you all were probably taught to do them in high school to get through this SAT writing test, right? That you have a very generic opening, a thesis statement, 3 supporting paragraphs that lead to that, and then at the end you restate your thesis statement, and then you pull out at the very end and say something very, very broad and say, and for these reasons, Claude Monet's paintings will always have a profound impact on society. Does that sound familiar? Okay, so he coined this term McEssay, and the way he sort of what he uses to illustrate it is that he was in charge for a while of processing those college essays that you all had to write, those very generic prompts, right? And the one that for UVA, the year that he had to do about 500 of these, was name an historical figure that has had a profound influence on your life. Now it's UVA. Who do you think most people picked?
Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson. So after he'd read about the 100th essay talking about Thomas Jefferson, he talked about wanting to off himself, right? I mean, that's kind of harsh, but he definitely rethought. He says, I think the line that he talks about, he says, you know, I really started to rethink my career, right? So think about that. And this is a good example, because one of the things you need to do after you write a paper is flip it around and think about it from the reader's perspective. Now, Professor Bresky's you got to read what, about 28 of these? Is that how many people in your class?
What, 28? Yep.
Yeah. So after about the 5th one that says something along the lines of, you know, somebody else give me a topic that they're working on.
Gender inequality.
Okay. You know, throughout history, women have had fewer rights than men, right? So when you see a line like that, Professor Bresky, what goes through your mind?
Go deeper.
Right. And you're probably not even processing that. Like you're kind of like, okay, ignore. Ah, here's something interesting. But and the thing is, we have to do that because we're paid to, right? But when you write in the real world, and I don't mean this in just like an essay, I mean this in a speech that you have to give, or if you're working on something collaboratively and you have to present it to a panel because you want to get funded for a grant in some sort of scientific field, you know, people aren't going to be nice enough to read those first 3 lines of filler, of boilerplate, and get to your ideas. They may just switch the channel, right? They may not look at what you're writing. All right, so how do you do it differently? Here's how you do it differently. And this is old school, but I'm going to update it for what you need to do digitally. And I'm sure some of you are doing a version of this already. But this is an actual page from my mentor at South Carolina. His name is David Cowart. And he wrote a book on the novels of Don DeLillo. And so each of the chapters of his book was about one of Don DeLillo's novels. And this is his actual copy of Don DeLillo's Players, one of his novels. So you can see here, right, like that it's riddled with red ink. And obviously he didn't do this in one setting, right? He probably had to read that book 30 times, to do a good job of writing, a chapter on it. So this is a record of his thoughts as he's not only initially reading this book, but as he rereads it. And you can, and again, the print is too small, but some of it is about other people, critics who have written about this book. Some of it is about literary theory. Some of it is about other parts of the book that are going to come into play that these particular passages evoke, right? But again, there's a couple of advantages here. First of all, he's captured the intellectual energy of processing this text. And when I say text here, I mean this in a guy named Mikhail Bakhtin talks about a text is anything that can be interpreted, right? So this class is a text. Timothy Chalamet is a text, a poem is a text, a podcast is a text. But anything you're working with in any of your classes that you have to process and interpret, this is the way you capture the energy of doing that. And there's another advantage too. It's also captured in a moment in time in the text that you're working with. So it's not just that you are writing a reaction, but you're also writing a reaction to a particular moment in that text. And if you think about it, okay, once you do that, and of course it probably needs some revision going from this marginalia to your paper, you've built the basic building block of a paper. And we call that a quotation sandwich. So a quotation sandwich, and again, it's kind of a hokey metaphor, but I haven't found one better, is every time you use any kind of data point or a quotation or a particular detail, right? Like the usage of the color blue in Van Gogh's Starry Night, all right? Anytime you do that, you want to think of that as the meat, or falafel if you're a vegetarian like my children. And you want to put two pieces of bread on either side of that. And the first piece of bread is the introduction. And that might be very perfunctory, right? Like, if you're using a particular source, you may have to identify it. Jane Smith in her profound article, Palestinian rights for women, says the following, right? And then you go into the quote. But it also can be something that you're using to begin to shape your reader's response on the front end. I actually did it very, very subtly there. I said in her profound article, right? So I'm making a value judgment there. But you might say something on the front end of like, many critics miss the point about Palestinian politics today and its effect on women. And then I go into the quotation. So that when I'm reading the quotation or the data point, you have already skewed me towards thinking about what you want me to think about. The second piece of bread, of course, is analysis, all right? And you can't imagine how many people often, in fact, about any article or book I ever read, I can find a place where people don't use the second piece of bread. They don't analyze the quotation or the data point that they're saying. And they do that for two reasons. One is they think it's so obvious that they don't need to say it. Or two, it was obvious to them when they put that quotation or data point in there, and they forget that they've got to turn that around and communicate it to the reader. Does that make sense? So you find 20, 30 of these, and that's a 6 or 8 page paper. The only thing that you have to do beyond that is to begin to organize the material. All right, so any questions about that? That's, again, I've been through a lot there. I want y'all to take some time and process that. Does that make sense? And by the way, you don't have to do this by photocopying all your articles out, printing your articles out, or writing in your library books. You can do this with a smartphone, right? That's how I do it now. If I'm watching a film and I want to make an interesting quote about something, I'll look at the timestamp, right? I'll say, I don't know, right now I'm watching Ted Lasso. Okay, Ted Lasso, episode 4, 17 minutes and 27 seconds. And I'll go, something along the lines of, Lasso's character here reminds me of a Boy Scout, or whatever I want to say, right? Or is profoundly naive here, okay? And I talk that into my phone. I mean, I love the dictation software, and it's built. And then when I go back, I've got this record of the moment in the text that I want to talk about and my initial thought. Now, obviously, it probably needs some development there, right? And some framing. And again, if you don't do the work on the front end with the marginalia, right? Like if you're reading Lord of the Flies and you write something in the margins about, this is a quote about humans versus nature. Yeah, the whole damn book is about that, right? So that's not going to help you. So you got to put some energy in as you're, reading or listening or watching the text that you're working with. but it will pay off because you will have done the work on the front end that ends up in your paper. Does that make some sense? Questions, thoughts? Are you already doing this?
No, yeah, I've never done that.
Okay. Again, you're probably doing versions of this, but I think breaking down the process into a methodology is very, very helpful. And again, it's also a great check and balance because you can go back and look at every quotation you've done. And if you immediately go to what we call dumped quotations, right? If you go from quotation to quotation and you're not processing them for the reader, then they're not gonna be able to follow what you're saying. Example I give for this too is I hate long block quotations, all right? Let's just my minor in my PhD program was 19th century British and Romantic poetry. And so if you give me 8 lines from Wordsworth, okay, and you don't rein me in after you give me those 8 lines, my marginalia, because I know something about Wordsworth, is going to go everywhere, right? I'm going to have tons of things that I'm bringing to bear as I'm rereading those 8 lines you gave me from Wordsworth, okay? So you've got to immediately rein me in and say, as you can see from line 3 here, Wordsworth is emphasizing the ephemeral nature of love, whatever. That's a terrible, anyway, on the cuff observation, right? So then I know what to focus in on. If you don't do that, your reader is going to wander mentally. They're not going to be reined in, and they're not going to like see what you're quoting as evidence and is pertinent to your topic. So there's also sort of this middle, you can think of it as a wave. You go from quoting something specific or using a data point or a statistic, and then you've got to do that middle work of analyzing it. And then you go all the way sometimes up to the top of your thesis and show how then this is an overall part of your argument. And then the process starts again. So like good papers, if you think like go from this wave of specific to general, specific to general. And one thing that is useful about the 5-paragraph topic is it is important to remind us at the beginning of paragraphs where we are and how, and to check in with your thesis so that your reader, it's called signposting, right? So the reader, as they're traveling along in your paper, knows, okay, now what is this for? Where are we going here? Where are we in your argument? All those things that your professors probably tell you to do, right? So I thought we'd look at an actual a book here and kind of reverse engineer this a little bit and show how it works. But before I do that, any questions or thoughts or marginalia you had in your head while I was producing this text?
I'm having a whole like blank moment. In like 2 sentences, I guess. Could you reiterate what my brain just completely just stopped working.
Yeah.
The word you just said.
Marginalia, yeah, and it's all that means is a fancy word for writing in the margins your thoughts. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was nuts about this, and this is crazy, but somebody has gone through all the books in his collection and collected his marginalia. So in other words, if he read, Herodotus, Roman history or whatever, someone has gone through and said, page 12 of Herodotus quoted the quote, and they've written down what Coleridge wrote in the margins. And so it's interesting, if you're a Coleridge scholar, you can kind of go back through and trace his mental history and how that might lead to what he wrote about, to his poetry. So it's the same thing, like you do this probably in class. Have you ever had a moment where Professor Bresky has said something, you don't hear the next 5 minutes of class because you're off on a mental train of thought? That is a marginalia. And it's actually oftentimes a good litmus test for something that you can write about, because whatever, she said or our classmate said or something that you read that was interesting enough to send you off on a mental tangent is probably interesting enough for a reader to go on that mental tangent with you.
I like the way you put that. My brain just lit up. Because I do that whenever I read anything. I'm just like, oh, this is interesting. I need to do these things later. But the idea of like the reader also, because like that makes a lot of sense. If you went off on a tangent, they probably will too.
Much better example, and probably from jerks you've had to deal with your whole lives and conversations. Have you ever talked to someone and they're not really listening to you, they're waiting for the next thing to say? Do you know why? Because you said something that sets off what they want to say, and then they're not listening to the next 6 things you say because they're waiting for the opportunity to give marginalia about your thoughts. And then this can happen over, talking about WandaVision or dinner or the current state of American politics. I mean, it doesn't matter, but I mean, this is a natural way that our brains work. all I'm asking you all to do is to capture these processes, because that energy will come back to you. I know I'm talking a lot and all over the place. Unfortunately, I'm a pretty tangential person, but to me, the great example of this is Frankenstein. That book was written from a ghostwriting contest between Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, Byron's doctor, Dr. Polidori, and Mary Shelley. And the other three people never finished their ghost story. They kind of use a dog ate my homework thing. It's pretty funny. The preface to Frankenstein talks about this. But she did, of course. And the first thing that she wrote, interestingly, is the moment when the creature takes life. And if you read that chapter, it's chapter 4. The first 3 chapters are this workaday chapter. She's got to figure out, lay down the background. It's pretty boring stuff. A lot of it's about alchemy, and it's really, really dry. But when that chapter takes place, it's like it crackles with energy. And to me, that's the beautiful thing about writing, is we can be long dead and our energy is captured in the writing. And you all know this as well, because you all read things and watch things all the time. You know when something's been phoned in, and you know when something's engaging, and it's because the authors or filmmakers or musicians have captured that energy. And so it's the same thing with you. If you're engaged, your reader is going to be engaged. And the way that you show and capture that energy and show your engagement is capturing it on the fly with what you're working with, whether it's a film or a podcast or a poem or a novel or an article. Does that make sense? So otherwise, you're kind of trapped into remembering semblances of that energy, right? Or of trying to recreate it when you haven't captured it initially. I mean, it's going to be a watered down version of that. I know I'm out where the buses don't run. Does that begin to make sense?
Question.
Yes.
So I just had this thought in my head. So essentially, like, we're writing our whatever it is we're writing on because it's obviously something that we're interested in, but we also kind of need to take a step aside from just our interest in it and really try to cater to the reader and see, okay, what is it that they're going to think about? Like, what is it that they're going to want to know after I say such and such?
Okay, that's a great question, and I got to pop up this thing again. Sorry. Okay, so here's the thing, Yasmin. I mean, good writers work on the text that you see in black. Great writers work on the text you see in red, because the next trick is anticipating what your readers are going to say in their marginalia and controlling that, right? So if you've got a big glaring, like, let's say, this is an example of this too. Like, if I'm going to give a presentation on Fight Club in Manhattan in 2002, okay, in 2001, so let's say October. I'm not picking that date very carefully. At the end of Fight Club, all these buildings collapse, okay? So if I'm giving a presentation about Fight Club and I show that scene and I ignore September 11th, all right, my entire audience is basically going, oh my gosh, he's just triggered me. That was about September 11th. Why isn't he talking about the buildings collapsing? There's still dust in the air, right? So great writers are going to look around and acknowledge and begin to anticipate what the marginalia is going to be about their work. Now, that's a really difficult skill set, right? I mean, again, that's a next level kind of thing. But for at you all's level and all of us, the best thing you can do at first is recognizing that your first draft of something is a monologue and you have to turn it into a dialogue. We talk about going from a me draft in the Writing Center to a we draft, right? And again, I mean, you can spend a lifetime figuring out how to control that marginalia of your readers, and you may get some success and some failures, but at least beginning to think about that process, because that's what leads you to statements like, many people may say that this is a faulty way of looking at this argument, but, right? I mean, again, you begin to sort of anticipate what the shortcomings of your argument is going to be along those lines. So again, I really didn't even intend to talk about that, but that's the next level of this. And Yasmin, your question made me think of that. Okay, so trigger warning. The text that I'm picking is about the Black Death. I just read, for some reason, I guess I'm a bit of a masochist. I read a bunch of stuff about the Black Death during the pandemic. I'm not sure if it was mentally healthy or not, but it sure was interesting. So anyway, let me share this screen. This is just a bit from a great book called The Great Mortality by John Kelly. So there's a concept in writing called going from old to new. And the idea is, when you move from one subject to the next, like in a paragraph form or in like moving from one section of your paper, if it's a longer thing, to a next section, you want to pick up a thread, okay, of the old section and then introduce something new. That's how you make good transitions. And I'll show you how this works here. Let me see if I can move it over. So this is from the middle of a chapter. And beforehand, the argument that he's talking about here is that there was a famine in the 13 teens, okay, that led to poor childhood nutrition that set up the world for the devastation that came in 1347 and 1348 with the Black Death. So, you know, people didn't have great bones or immune systems because they were eating horrible foods, right? And so again, this is what the section is about. So this is the transitional material that's going into the next section, and I'm just going to read it out loud here. The imbalance between food and population. Okay, that's the old information. All right. So there was this great famine in the 13 teens, and that's what the whole section prior to this has been about. So the imbalance between food and population was not the only disease risk factor in the medieval environment. Okay, the only thing new here is not the only. Okay, because we've been talking about imbalances in between, you know, food and population with famine. All right. Then again, this is mostly old information. Long before the weather turned and the land gave out and the grain became covered with mold and fungi. And again, this is all from the previous section. The continent was producing more garbage than it could dispose of. Circa 1200, the medieval city was drowning in filth, and in the post-boom decades, the situation may have worsened as thousands of dispossessed peasants flooded into urban Europe, animals in tow. By the third decade of the 14th century, the amount of refuse on the medieval street was so great, it was literally driving men to murder. But the new information here is the garbage. So I've talked about famine and how that was a setup for the Black Death, okay, the Great Mortality. And now I'm going to talk about garbage. But what I do to ease the reader into that is I pick up a thread of that old section, and then I move it, and then I move you with me into the new section about garbage. Okay, so that's where it works on a section level. So let me just pull down here to just almost any paragraph. And this guy John Kelly is incredibly didactic. I mean, like what's the word I want to say here? Overly organized about this. I mean, pretty much any paragraph you pull out, he does this old to new, but it's a great teaching tool. And the result is it's a very readable book. Okay, all right. So right here, for example, an occasion so the paragraph before was about, however, if radish were phobic about long distance travel, it would still be an obscure Asian oddity like the Komodo dragon lizard. Rats do travel, and often for reasons that highlight the role of trade and ecological disasters and plague. So, okay, so the new information at the end of this paragraph is that rats travel sometimes because of trade and sometimes because of ecological disaster. So then when I start the new paragraph, for an example, right? So I'm going to illustrate what I just said I've set it up because I'm going to illustrate what I say in the next paragraph. And then just going down to the next paragraph beyond that, under normal conditions, rat migrations are infrequent, but under conditions of ecological disaster, one imagines that they might become quite common. For distances beyond the multi-kilometer range, old information, okay, that's what I talked about before, radish relies on its longtime companion, man. And now we're going to talk about, you know, like going along with trade routes. Anyway, but I mean, it's just everywhere, but that's how you keep your reader straight. So that's the next step. After you develop these quotation sandwiches and you've built these interesting bits of information, you've got to guide the reader through and do this signposting through topic, sentences, and transitions. Again, we call it signposting in the Writing Center. You know, all right, so here's another example. Rivers of blood, this is gross, sorry. Rivers of blood seeped into nearby gardens and parks, and piles of hearts, livers, and intestines accumulated under the butcher's bloody boots, attracting swarms of flies, rats, and street urchins. Okay, so again, this is the material above has been about how butchers led to this, you know, awful situation on the medieval streets that made, you know, rats and fleas common, that led to this vast devastation of the Black Death. But then, you know, then here's another way to transition that. So we've already talked about that. That's old information, but the new information starts off with the topic sentence. The greatest urban polluter, and I could have said, however, was probably the full chamber pot. And now you know that I'm going to talk about chamber pots. So if you think about reverse engineering this, the person John Kelly went through and he found all these interesting facts about medieval, the life on the medieval streets, right? And so he probably, if you get back our old handy dandy note card, he found out something about medieval butchers, right? And then he found out something about the problem of chamber pots. And I went to Edinburgh once upon a time, and what they used to say is "Gardez-lou," watch out for the water. And people would throw their urine and feces basically from chamber pots into the street. And the only warning was they'd say "Gardez-lou," right? Watch out for the water. It's not water. So my point is that, I take those two data points and I start thinking about, okay, all right, so my overall, what are these things about? There's an interesting fact about, chamber pots being thrown out on the streets and medieval butchers. Oh, obviously they're both about, the filth in the streets and how that led to problems of the Black Death. So I started off with the notes, just finding this information, but then these organizing principles begin to emerge. And again, I'm not going to pop up the Avengers thing, but the next step after you've gotten your notes is you can literally go through and cut and paste and begin to organize this material and build an exoskeleton of your paper, or you can do it with a highlighter, or the modern way I think that's interesting is you can start building Twitter hashtags, right? So if you go through your paper and you've got a paragraph, and you can't write a Twitter hashtag about your paragraph, like in this case, it would be chamber pots, right? In the paragraph beforehand, it would be butchers, right? Then you've got an organizing principle problem. And so again, you may need to reorganize those quotation sandwiches, get them out, move them around in ways until you find these organizing principles that will allow your reader to go through and follow your argument. And again, as you can see, I get kind of manic and caught up in all this stuff and forget to stop and to breathe and all those things. But thoughts are again, marginalia about what I said there. Does that give you all more of a methodology?
I think I'm definitely gonna go and look at some of the papers that I've turned in and do some cutting and some editing after this class just to kind of get my thoughts together.
Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, it's also, here's the thing. It's not an easy thing to do. You forget these lessons constantly. I'll give you an example from my own life. I write these little podcasts for the Grandin Theater here in town, and they can only be a minute long. And so one of the first ones I ever did was about this really awful movie about drones, American drones hurting, killing civilians in Iraq. The first one of those I did, I popped in a soundbite from the movie, just a piece of dialogue. Okay, I didn't introduce it. I didn't say Helen Mirren's character Jane, talks about the horrors she experiences when drones kill civilians. That's really bad introductory example. And then you go into the soundbite, and I didn't analyze it afterwards. So I've spent 20 years plus, 25 years telling people to sandwich quotations. And then when I was faced with a new rhetorical situation, making this podcast, this minute-long podcast, I completely forgot it. And so I know, same thing. I can go through my old papers, I'm sure, and find lots of evidence where I didn't go through this methodology. But it at least is sort of a way to begin to get you to think about the role of the reader, right? Because the intro and the two pieces of bread are designed to make your thoughts reader friendly, and then on a macro level, the topic sentences and transitions are designed to walk your reader through your arguments. And those things, again, they don't come easily, right? Because you're having to do the work of not only your writing and the first audience is you, right? You're trying to engage with this material and understand it, but then you have to do that second level of communicating that to your reader, and it's anything but intuitive. I think it's very, very hard to do. It's, again, I'm sorry, I'm not a very organized person. I should have these in Roman numerals, and every time I do this, I do it a little bit differently. But that's actually, I think, a lesson here too. Once you get 30, let's say that you get 30 interesting thoughts about reproductive rights in Palestine. Okay, there are probably 100, dozens and dozens of ways you could write that paper and organize it. Right? There's different orders, different, the quotes might end up in different sections, all those kinds of things. There's no one right order or way to organize that material. but the effort is just there to sort of just to bundle it up together in packages that get you from point A to point B and get the reader from point A to point B. And so I guess what I'm saying is the text that is me sharing my thoughts about how to write papers, the order of that and how I do it is different every time. And I'm sure that there are ways that are more effective sometimes than others, but hopefully, I convey the information and I walk you through it in a way that makes sense. Right. And so again, that might just be an excuse because I'm not a very organized writer. In fact, one of the things that's hard for me, and I bet some of you out there can relate to this, is sometimes I'll have a great section, an interesting section of a paper that really doesn't fit with my overall argument. And I'll do all sorts of mental gymnastics to try to get that section in. I'll write clever introductions or topic sentences and transitions, but eventually I have to abandon it and realize, yeah, that's an interesting thought, but that's for another paper, and I'll cut it, right? And that's really difficult for me to do. But again, if it's not part of what you're trying to convey to the reader in this paper, you have to do that work. You have to kind of cut that material out. So that's another thing. I mean, once you get your notes down, recognizing if something doesn't fit, don't agonize over it, cut it, right? And just use what you can use. You can organize and make reader friendly, because if you can't figure out where it goes, your reader's not going to figure out where it goes when they read it. I'm here too, and the tutors are here. So if you want to send me something, or the tutors, let me know. But again, well, thank you all very much. I mean, again, one last thought that I would say is, I think that it's become more difficult to do what you all do than it was in my day, because when I was working on that Defeat of the Spanish Armada paper, I was discovering these cool things about what are called hellbirds. That one of the ways that the British defeated the Spanish is they loaded up these small ships with gunpowder, and then they would blow up and destroy like 6 ships. And it felt like I was discovering that information. I mean, I wasn't, right? But there was an excitement there that I was uncovering like a detective. And that joy is disappeared for you all, because when you search a subject on Google in nanoseconds, it tells you that 30 other people have written about that topic. Right? And so it's like we tell you all to be these beautiful snowflakes, but you immediately realize that you're not beautiful snowflakes. And I overheard this too when I was in your breakout rooms. Someone said that like that they're daunted when they don't find information about a topic, right? Like that you don't want to be too specific because you might not be able to find sources. I mean, to me, again, I think this is a difference in thinking. That's what we call in the business world a blue ocean. Like you get to go out into a unnavigated waters and build your own world. And again, that may not be entirely appropriate in a class where you do have to come up with sources and that type of thing, but don't be afraid to tackle topics that haven't been thought about much before. I mean, that's when you do become beautiful snowflakes, right? I mean, it's more work. You have to go and there's a lot more marginalia. You can't step on, you can't stand on the shoulders of giants and use data. But I mean, again, to me, it's much more exciting because you become, you're the captain of your own fate, right? I mean, and down the road, if you do go to graduate school or something like that, I mean, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for a niche, a place that you can carve out your own intellectual space. And so I see that a lot, that people are afraid to sort of enter these blue oceans, but I think it's really healthy and important.